Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are looking at the architecture of human identity. Have you ever wondered what actually happens inside the brain of someone who undergoes a massive, fundamental spiritual shift?
Right, like a total rewiring.
Exactly. Because we usually picture a sudden lightning bolt, a catastrophic, highly emotional event that just rewires a person overnight.
Yeah, that's the stereotype.
But the data tells a completely different and frankly much slower and far more deeply psychological story. I mean, think about it less like building a new house on an empty lot and much more like trying to completely rewrite the underlying source code of a computer's operating system.
Right.
But doing it while the computer's still running, processing data, and, actively connected to the internet.
It's the ultimate exercise in psychological engineering. When a human being alters their core meaning system, they cannot just power down, step outside of themselves, install the new software, and reboot.
Yeah, that's impossible.
Right, because they are the software, they are the hardware, and they are the programmer simultaneously.
Which brings us to the core mission for today's deep dive into the source material. We are looking at a massive, incredibly diverse stack of sources today. I mean, we have ethnographic studies, dense theological essays.
Addiction recovery clinic notes, too?
Yes,
Okay.
addiction recovery notes, Reddit threads, and deeply personal memoirs. And our goal is to take all of this and unpack the actual functional anatomy of Christian conversion and self-transformation. We are going to look at how daily routines, the specific words we use to describe our trauma, and, well, our absolute darkest moments actually fuel this change.
Before we delve into the mechanics of that transformation, though, it's really crucial to establish the parameters of our analysis today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to you listening right now, we want to be incredibly clear. Our goal today is not to preach. We are not here to proselytize, and we are absolutely not taking sides on any politically charged religious debates.
Right.
We're here to act as entirely impartial guides. We are exploring the psychological, the sociological, and the deeply human mechanics of meaning-making that are laid out in these specific sources.
Because whether a listener holds these beliefs, opposes them vehemently, or is entirely indifferent, the underlying psychological mechanisms of how a human being completely reconstructs their worldview, well, they're universally relevant.
Yeah, we are looking at the universal architecture of human change.
Exactly.
So if we want to understand how a person changes the entire architecture of their identity, we first have to locate the initial spark. Right?
Yeah.
Like, what is the actual catalyst that makes someone look at their internal operating system and decide this entire code needs to be rewritten?
To answer that, we really must examine the ethnographic study provided in our sources by Stout and Dane, which focused heavily on British evangelical Christians.
Okay.
Their findings systematically dismantle the pop culture stereotype of conversion. Popular culture loves that Paul on the road to Damascus narrative, right?
A blinding light.
Exactly. The idea that conversion is almost universally a sudden, emotionally overwhelming, and completely spontaneous external event. A blinding light that literally knocks you off your horse.
But Stout and Dane's interviews reveal that this dramatic, spontaneous event is actually a statistical anomaly.
It's extremely rare.
Right. For the vast majority of people, conversion is highly gradual, which signals a massive shift from what sociologists categorize as a passive paradigm to an active one. Modern converts are rarely passive recipients of a sudden emotional shock.
Right, they're active seekers.
Yes, and the catalyst they are responding to isn't a sudden external tragedy like losing a job or a horrible accident, but rather a profound, escalating sense of what the researchers call internal disharmony.
Yeah, internal disharmony is essentially an escalating identity crisis. It is a severe discrepancy between who you currently are, like your actions, your daily reality, and who you deeply feel you ought to be.
It's cognitive dissonance on a spiritual scale.
That's a perfect way to phrase it.
Let's look at the essay from Gary Abu Jr. in the sources, because, well, it illustrates this cognitive dissonance perfectly. Here is an individual who had achieved the absolute pinnacle of worldly, secular success. He is delivering TED Talks, he's being honored at the White House.
Right, so externally, there is no crisis at all. He is entirely insulated by professional triumph.
Yet the internal disharmony he describes is absolute. He explicitly notes that with every single professional achievement, the internal void just widened. He was sacrificing his marriage and his relationship with his infant child on the altar of his career.
Operating under the assumption that external validation would eventually quiet that internal friction.
Exactly. He writes, it worked until it didn't anymore. It reached a terminal velocity where his wife was literally packing her bags to leave him. He was at the absolute apex of his career, yet hurtling toward personal annihilation.
And the external world had no idea.
None. The friction between the is and the ought finally broke the system. Contrast that with the starkly different story from a Reddit user in our sources, who describes being deep in a world of drug addiction and dealing.
Right, the environmental circumstances could not be more opposite, yet the psychological mechanism is identical.
It's fascinating. This Reddit user explicitly states they didn't even view the drug dealing as the primary crisis at the time. They had money, they were constantly surrounded by people partying. The catalyst was an overwhelming, crushing emptiness.
Yeah?
They describe standing in the shower, feeling profoundly isolated and pointless, and throwing out an insanely bold challenge to the universe. They essentially said, God, if you are real, prove it by sending the very next person to my door.
They are demanding an immediate, tangible resolution to an intolerable internal void.
And before they even turn the water off, there is a knock at the door. They freeze, wait, and a stranger slides 20 to 30 Bible tracts under the door.
Oh, wow.
Now, regardless of how someone interprets that event, the sociological spark was not the drugs. The spark was the internal disharmony reaching a critical mass where the individual actively demanded a new framework.
Which perfectly aligns with the psychological framework provided by researcher Raymond Paluzian in our sources.
Right. Paluzian proposed a comprehensive model of meaning systems. His theory dictates that for any meaning system to undergo radical change, there must be a persistent pressure upon the system.
So if the sudden lightning bolt is a myth, we should probably stop comparing life transformation to an earthquake. It is far more accurate to compare it to a slow leak in a tire.
I like that analogy.
You're driving down the highway and you feel a slight pull to the right. You ignore it. You hear a slight thumping sound. You turn up the radio to drown it out. But that pressure upon the system is relentless until finally the tire's shredded, you are on the side of the road, and you are forced to admit, well, I literally cannot keep driving the way I have been driving.
That slow leak forces the individual to pull over, completely stop their forward momentum, and actively begin searching the trunk for a new framework to make sense of their reality.
So if that internal friction forces a hard reset of the system, where does a rational mind actually go to find a new operating system? Because when we dive into the history collection source detailing 25 famous atheists who converted, the data shows people walking down incredibly diverse and, frankly, completely contradictory paths to arrive at the exact same destination.
Yeah, this brings us to the tension between the intellectual path and the mystical path.
Exactly.
The sheer adaptability of the religious meaning system is remarkable here. It can accommodate the highest echelons of empirical scientific rigor, as well as deeply esoteric subjective experiences.
Let's unpack the intellectuals first, because they completely dismantle the lazy assumption that adopting a faith system requires a person to just check their critical thinking skills at the door. Look at Dr. Francis Collins, the director of the Human Genome Project.
A brilliant mind.
One of the top scientific minds on the planet. A man whose entire career is built on empirical, measurable, replicable data. He viewed religion as pure, outdated superstition.
Yet his shift did not require him to abandon the scientific method. It was triggered by his recognition of its hard limits.
Exactly. Collins was a physician watching his patients die. He realized they were grappling with massive existential questions about the purpose of suffering, the nature of morality, and the concept of an afterlife.
Questions that an MRI machine or DNA sequencer simply cannot measure.
Right. He encountered the concept of the moral law, an innate human understanding of right and wrong that transcends evolutionary biology, which led him to realize that empirical science and spiritual faith are answering two completely different sets of questions. Science answers the how, while faith answers the why.
Then consider the investigative path of Lee Strobel, a legal editor for the Chicago Tribune. Strobel approached the concept of faith as a hostile witness.
He really did.
He applied razor-sharp journalistic skepticism and the legal standards of evidence to the historical claims of the Gospels with the explicit professional intention to permanently debunk his wife's newfound faith.
He treated it like a murder trial. He interviewed experts, cross-examined the historical documentation, analyzed the archaeological records, and ultimately concluded that the evidentiary burden of proof supported the historical resurrection. He essentially argued himself into a corner using his own legal framework.
We also see this rigorous Coles logic in the conversion of G.E. Anscombe, a towering analytic philosopher.
Oh, her story is wild.
It is. Anscombe arrived at Catholicism through the dense, systematic philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. She utilized Aquinas' cosmological arguments, specifically the concept of the prime mover and the necessity of an uncaused cause to explain the existence of contingent beings.
Right.
Her colleagues at Oxford were entirely baffled, but for Anscombe, it was a purely rational, inescapable philosophical deduction.
And we cannot discuss intellectual conversions without bringing up C.S. Lewis. I mean, a man who literally described himself as the most reluctant convert in all England. Lewis was a hardened materialist. He believed that matter and nature were all that existed.
But his brilliant academic peers, specifically J.R.R. Tolkien, relentlessly chipped away at his worldview.
Yeah, Tolkien challenged Lewis's chronological snobbery.
Which is such a great phrase.
It really is. It's the arrogant assumption that modern thought is inherently superior to ancient thought simply because it is newer. Tolkien argued that the Christian narrative was a true myth, a story that satisfied the human imagination's deepest desires while also being historically grounded. Lewis was dragged, kicking and screaming through grueling intellectual debates until his materialist worldview just fractured under the weight of its own logical inconsistencies.
All of these individuals, Collins, Strobel, Anscombe, Lewis, they utilized their massive intellects to map the genome, interrogate the history, and debate the philosophy until they walked through the front door of this new meaning system.
But the sources also highlight individuals who entered through a completely different door, a path that entirely bypasses the intellect. Look at the mystical conversions. John C. Wright was a highly successful science fiction author and a strict philosophical materialist. If he couldn't touch it, measure it, or see it under a microscope, it did not exist.
Period.
Period. He suffers a massive heart attack, and while in the throes of this medical crisis, he experiences profound, unexplainable supernatural visions. In a matter of hours, decades of entrenched materialist philosophy are completely shattered by a subjective mystical experience.
We see a parallel in the actor Gary Busey, who is living a famously hedonistic Hollywood lifestyle. He suffers a near-fatal motorcycle crash, undergoes emergency brain surgery, and reports visiting another spiritual realm during the procedure.
So we have Dr. Francis Collins mapping 3 billion letters of human DNA over decades, and we have Gary Busey crashing a motorcycle without a helmet. How can psychology possibly reconcile these as the exact same phenomenon?
By looking at the neurological and psychological endpoint, Paladzian's theory states that a conversion is a total restructuring of a person's ultimate concern. Their entire socio-cognitive system, their deeply held values, their daily goals, their attitudes, and the very definition of their identity, it's all fundamentally reorganized around a new center of gravity.
So the intellectual path of debating Aquinas and the mystical path of a near-death experience are simply different mechanisms designed to bypass the ego's unique defense systems. They are just different doors leading into the exact same psychological architecture.
Yes. But once the individual walks through that door, however, they are faced with a monumental task. They have abandoned their old meaning system, the old house is torn down, so how do they actually construct the new self?
This brings us to a fascinating sociological concept detailed in Peter G. Stromberg's study, Language and Self-Transformation. Stromberg dives into the actual science of language and how vocabulary builds reality.
We generally operate under the assumption that language is merely descriptive, right? Like if I say the car is blue, I am simply using words to describe a pre-existing reality. Linguists call this referential language.
But Stromberg argues that when we look at conversion narratives, the language is doing something much heavier. He introduces the concept of constitutive language. This is language that doesn't just describe reality, it literally creates reality the moment it is spoken.
A classic example is a judge in a courtroom. When a judge bangs a gavel and says, "I sentence you to 10 years, those words do not describe a situation. Those words legally create a new reality. The individual transforms into a prisoner solely because that specific language was spoken by an authority.
Or a minister saying, "I now pronounce you married." The words build the new social contract. So applying that to a psychological transformation, Stromberg observes that people entering this new faith system bring a massive amount of past emotional baggage.
Yeah, they have deep unresolved trauma and that internal disharmony we discussed.
Right, but they often lack the vocabulary to even understand their own pain. It is an inarticulable knot in their psyche.
They feel the friction, but they do not possess the linguistic tools to map it. Stromberg theorizes that when these individuals adopt the highly specific, symbolic language of evangelical Christianity, words like sin, redemption, grace, spiritual warfare, and salvation, they finally possess a framework that maps perfectly onto their internal chaos.
Wait, I need to stop you there and push back. Because to a skeptic reading this sociological theory or, listening right now, it sounds like Stromberg is describing a massive subconscious game of fake it till you make it.
I can see how it sounds like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Like if I decide I want to be a surfer and I buy a board and I force myself to use surfer slang, seeing things like gnarly waves to describe my everyday problems, do I eventually just psychologically morph into a surfer because I use the vocabulary long enough? Is it just complex psychological imitation?
That is a fundamental misreading of the sociological mechanism. It is not about imitation, it is about psychological translation. Imagine carrying a document written in a language you cannot read, and that document dictates why you are in constant pain.
You know the pain is real, but you can't read the diagnosis.
Precisely. Now, the religious language acts as the Rosetta Stone. By taking their vague, unnameable emotional trauma and reframing it as sin that requires grace or an internal struggle that is actually spiritual warfare, they are finally able to articulate the inarticulable.
That makes a lot of sense.
They are constitutively building a new reality. By performing this narrative, they literally untie the emotional knot. When that language successfully translates their trauma, it releases a visceral flood of relief, meaning, and commitment.
The language provides the structural blueprint for the new identity. But a blueprint cannot keep the rain out. If language is the scaffolding, what actually builds the house day by day? That brings us to the neurobiology of daily habits.
The source document titled 9 Christian Habits explicitly states that this transformation is not a static one-time achievement. It cites the biblical text Romans 12.2, which commands followers to be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Which is an ancient theological concept that perfectly mirrors the modern neuroscientific understanding of neuroplasticity. The brain is malleable, but it requires daily, repetitive action to forge new neural pathways.
Exactly.
The source lists several key habits, and when you look at them through a psychological lens, they are intensely powerful cognitive behavioral tools.
The first habit highlighted is prayer and scripture reading, specifically at the start of the day.
The psychological utility here is brilliant. Think about the default modern mindset. We wake up, we immediately grab our phones, we read stressful work emails, we doom scroll the news, and we instantly flood our brains with cortisol. We set our cognitive baseline to reactive anxiety.
Oh, it's brutal.
The habit of prayer and scripture actively disrupts that. It forces the individual to start the day with connection rather than consumption. It uses the text as a literal cognitive filter to block out societal pressures regarding status, wealth, and secular success.
It establishes an entirely different socio-cognitive baseline. The next habit, gratitude, functions similarly on a neurochemical level.
Right. The source cites 1 Thessalonians 5.18, give thanks in all circumstances. The text does not claim that all circumstances are objectively good. Instead, gratitude forces a psychological pivot. When we focus on what we lack, like the promotion we didn't get, the house we can't afford, our brains generate envy and anxiety.
Gratitude actively forces the brain to catalog what is present.
Yes, and studies show this regular practice physically increases dopamine and serotonin production. It is a biological hack wrapped in a theological command.
Which brings us to the deeply complex habits of kindness and forgiveness, rooted in texts like Matthew 6.14.
Forgiveness might be the heaviest psychological lift in this entire system. Holding on to bitterness and resentment is a biological defense mechanism. We hold grudges to protect ourselves from future harm.
Right, it's survival.
But doing so keeps the brain locked in a low-grade fight-or-flight state, constantly producing stress hormones. The source frames forgiveness not as letting an abuser off the hook or pretending trauma didn't occur, but as an active severing of that stress loop. You release the bitterness to create cognitive space for your own healing.
And finally, the habit of service and community, utilizing the early church model from the book of Hebrews.
This shifts the individual's focus outward. Psychologists refer to the helper's high, the endorphin release that occurs when we assist others. Furthermore, doing this within a tight-knit community provides a robust network of accountability, fundamentally destroying the isolation that breeds depression.
To understand the depth of these habits, we must return to Palautzian's theory of personality change. Palautzian notes a vital nuance. Religious conversion rarely, if ever, alters a person's core biological temperamental traits.
So if you are naturally introverted or naturally highly neurotic, a spiritual conversion does not suddenly rewire your base biology to make you an extrovert.
Right. A shy person remains a shy person. What these daily habits change are what Pelotzian calls mid-level traits. These are your overarching purposes, your specific goals, your daily attitudes, and your core values.
Interesting.
The habits of filtering the world through scripture, forcing gratitude to raise dopamine, executing forgiveness to lower cortisol, and serving others, these habits systematically rewire how your base temperament interacts with the external world.
The house has the same foundation, but the entire interior has been remodeled.
Precisely.
But according to the Stout and Dean ethnographic study, all of this language and all of these habits eventually culminate in the most radical and, frankly, most misunderstood psychological shift of all. The absolute core of the Christian transformation, the concept of dying to self.
From a purely secular psychological perspective, dying to self sounds incredibly morbid.
Yeah,
It conjures images of cult-like brainwashing, where the goal is to erase the individual's personality, their humor, and their unique quirks, turning them into a subservient drone.
But the ethnographic informants in the study completely reject that definition. They clarify that dying to self does not mean the destruction of the ego or the eradication of the personality. What dies is self-absorption.
Right.
It is the death of the relentless, exhausting, evolutionary need to be the center of your own universe. The self-centered worldview is systematically replaced by a God-centered worldview.
To understand the psychological relief this provides, we should look back at the essay from Gary Aboud Jr., as he provides a profound physical analogy for this theological concept.
Gary is a double cornea transplant recipient. A severe childhood disease destroyed his physical sight. To regain his vision, he required the corneas of a donor. Let the reality of that sink in. He states it plainly: someone literally had to die so that he could receive a gift he could never possibly earn and could never possibly repay to the grieving family.
A family lost their child so that Gary could see.
Exactly. It is a devastating, beautiful physical reality of unearned grace. When Gary applied that physical reality to his spiritual life, when he examined the theological concept of Jesus dying to offer unearned grace, it completely shattered his previous worldview. He realized his entire existence had been defined by striving, working relentlessly to earn secular success, striving to earn the love of his peers, and subconsciously striving to earn God's acceptance through merit.
The realization of grace completely short-circuits the engine of meritocracy.
Because you cannot earn a cornea. You cannot work hard enough to deserve someone else's eye. You can only receive it, be overwhelmed with gratitude, and rest in that gift.
In psychological terms, Gary is describing a complete structural transfer of the locus of control.
It is like you have been driving a massive bus full of passengers down a treacherous, icy mountain road in the dead of night. You have been driving for 40 years without sleep.
Oh, that sounds stressful.
Right. You are terrified you are going to crash and destroy everyone you love.
Right.
But you physically cannot let go of the steering wheel because you believe you are the only one who can drive. And finally, someone taps you on the shoulder and says, "I know the road. I have the wheel. You can go sit in the back."
Wow.
Yes, you lose control of the bus.
Yeah.
But the sheer, overwhelming relief of not having to be in control anymore brings immeasurable peace.
The ethnographic data is full of informants reporting this exact paradox. Human psychology generally dictates that losing control induces severe anxiety.
Normally.
However, within this specific meaning system, because the entity taking control, God, is viewed as perfectly loving, omniscient, and entirely capable, transferring the locus of control entirely removes the crushing burden of human perfection.
If you are no longer the ultimate author and sustainer of your own universe, you are finally allowed to be flawed. You are allowed to be weak. The pressure to be a god yourself is completely removed.
Surrendering the wheel of the bus is a beautiful, deeply peaceful psychological concept when an individual is simply exhausted from the daily grind of driving. But we must test this framework against the extremes. What happens when the bus is already actively driving off a cliff?
This brings us to the crucible of addiction. We have to examine how this spiritual framework applies to the absolute darkest, most biologically destructive human struggles. Our source from Life Renewal Behavioral Health outlines the Christian perspective on addiction recovery. Right away, the framing diverges from a purely secular medical model.
They acknowledge that addiction is absolutely a physical disease that alters brain chemistry and a psychological disorder.
Yes, but they also view it fundamentally as a state of deep spiritual bondage or slavery. They reference 1 Corinthians 6.12, emphasizing the danger of being mastered by anything.
This holistic approach is critical in the recovery space. Evidence-based medical and psychological treatments, medical detox, cognitive behavioral therapy, medication-assisted treatment, they are essential to address the physical dependency.
Of course.
But treating only the physical symptoms is akin to taking pain medication for a broken leg without setting the bone. Adding the spiritual framework attacks the addiction holistically by specifically targeting the psychological engine of substance abuse, which is the shame cycle.
The shame cycle is a brutal neurobiological loop. An individual feels emotional pain or emptiness. They use a substance, alcohol, heroin, pornography,
Yeah.
to artificially spike dopamine and numb the pain.
Right.
The substance wears off, and they wake up feeling intense, crushing shame and self-condemnation about using the substance. This shame creates massive emotional pain, which triggers the brain to seek the substance again to numb the new pain.
If we recall our discussion on the locus of control and the concept of unearned grace, we see how the Christian framework actively dismantles this cycle. The radical acceptance and absolute forgiveness offered by the concept of grace allows the addict to short-circuit the shame cycle.
If God offers total forgiveness, the crushing weight of self-condemnation is lifted.
Furthermore, the habits we discussed earlier become absolute lifelines. Addiction thrives in two specific environmental conditions: profound isolation and a deep sense of meaninglessness.
Which is where the community comes in.
Exactly. The Christian community, utilizing the early church model, provides an intense, structured network of highly accountable relationships, directly destroying isolation.
And the habits of daily service and gratitude directly destroy meaninglessness. The religious meaning system provides the exact psychological and sociological antidotes to the environmental conditions that allow substance abuse to flourish. It replaces the artificial chemical high with a deep, sustainable communal purpose.
The sources mention incredibly high-profile examples of this framework successfully battling severe pathology. You have Kirk Franklin, a massive gospel star, openly discussing overcoming crippling addictions to pornography and alcohol through his faith framework.
Yeah. And you have Ryan Leaf, the former NFL quarterback whose life totally unraveled into felony arrests due to prescription medication addiction, finding sobriety and purpose through a spiritually focused recovery program.
Pop stars like Katy Perry have spoken about faith aiding in moments of severe darkness.
And perhaps most famously, Eric Clapton, who survived a notoriously brutal heroin addiction in the 1970s, explicitly crediting his spiritual surrender for helping him achieve and maintain decades of sobriety.
The empirical data supports the efficacy of these meaning systems in addiction recovery. However, a rigorous, impartial deep dive requires us to examine the null hypothesis.
We have to. We have looked at how this system saves lives, gives purpose, and pulls people from the abyss. But we promise to look at the entire landscape. We must examine the sources that show what happens when the human element of this massive institution fails.
What happens when the system fractures and alienates the very people it claims to save?
To understand this, we turn to the massive Reddit thread in our sources titled, "How Has Christianity Changed Your Life?" As we noted, countless users cited escaping depression and finding life purpose. But sprinkled throughout the thread are starkly different, painfully real alternate realities.
These are the voices of individuals for whom the religious meaning system did not resolve internal disharmony, but rather deeply exacerbated it.
Let's look closely at the testimony of a user named Dixon. Dixon writes that their upbringing in the church taught them a massive, overarching lesson to never trust religion or anyone wielding moral authority. And they do not cite abstract theological disagreements, they cite specific, systemic, institutional failures.
Dixon points to the earthly institution of the church actively protecting abusers within its ranks. They point to powerful political leaders cynically utilizing the language of faith to justify warfare and violence.
Yeah.
They point to institutional movements actively fighting against the civil rights of marginalized groups, specifically gay rights.
For Dixon, the institution wasn't a hospital for the broken, it was an active source of trauma. Then you have a user like NinjaTune, whose entire response to the question of how Christianity changed their life is one blunt, devastating sentence: "It turned me into an atheist."
And we also see a fascinating middle ground from a user named Bruce Luce. This user writes that they have stepped away from the faith entirely. They are no longer a Christian. However, they explicitly credit the religion and their time spent within it for shaping them into a kind, loving, and understanding person.
Which perfectly illustrates Palazian's theory on mid-level traits.
Exactly.
Bruce Luce retained the mid-level trait changes, the habits of kindness, the values of understanding, but they entirely discarded the overarching theological software. So how do we sociologically analyze these negative experiences?
We return to Stromberg's concept of constitutive language and the theory of cognitive dissonance. We establish that when the religious framework functions optimally, when it offers meaning, translates trauma through symbolic language, and provides a mechanism for grace, it transforms lives beautifully.
But what happens when the earthly, deeply flawed human institution contradicts its own constitutive language? The Church preaches a theology of radical, self-sacrificial love and ultimate forgiveness.
Wow.
But the actual human beings running the institution practice exclusion, or protect abusers to save public face, or wage political war against their neighbors.
That glaring hypocrisy creates massive cognitive dissonance. The beautiful symbolic language the individual is using to construct their internal reality is suddenly completely at odds with the toxic external reality they are experiencing within the community.
The blueprint for the house is structurally sound, but the contractors are using rotten wood and faulty wiring.
Exactly. When that cognitive dissonance becomes too loud, the pressure upon the system becomes unbearable. Just as internal disharmony acted as a catalyst toward conversion for Gary Boo Jr., this profound institutional hypocrisy acts as a powerful reverse catalyst.
It pushes them away.
It prompts a conversion away from the faith entirely, often leaving the individual with a deep, lingering distrust of all authority and organized meaning systems.
So as we pull all the way back to view this entire architectural project of human identity, we see an incredibly complex landscape. We started with the slow leak, the internal disharmony and cognitive dissonance that forces an individual to pull over and seek a new operating system.
Right.
We explored how brilliant scientists looking at the moral limits of DNA and devastated addicts looking at the bottom of a shower can walk through completely different intellectual or mystical doors to arrive at the exact same psychological destination, shifting their ultimate concern.
We examine how the very vocabulary of faith acts as a Rosetta Stone, constitutively translating unnameable trauma into a navigable reality. We saw how daily habits like gratitude and service physically rewire mid-level personality traits by regulating dopamine and cortisol.
We looked at the profound psychological relief of surrendering the steering wheel, the death of self-absorption, and how the radical concept of unearned grace provides the only effective mechanism to short-circuit the deadly neurobiological shame cycle of addiction.
And finally, we confronted the complex, messy reality of the human institution, recognizing that when the builders abandon the blueprint, hypocrisy can shatter the very meaning system it is attempting to uphold.
It is a profound testament to the sheer complexity of the human mind, our deep biological drive for community, and our desperate, beautiful need for coherent meaning in a chaotic world.
It really is.
And that is exactly why this deep dive matters to you, the listener. Whether you consider yourself a devout believer resting in grace, a hardened skeptic demanding empirical proof, an atheist wounded by institutional hypocrisy, or someone floating somewhere in between.
Yeah.
The mechanics we discussed today, how humans radically alter their core identity, how we use symbolic language to untie the knots of our pain, and how we form daily habits to survive our environments, those mechanisms are universally applicable. Every single one of us is actively building a meaning system to survive the friction of being alive.
Which leaves us with a final, highly practical challenge to consider, drawn directly from Peter Stromberg's insights on the power of language. We learned today that the vocabulary we use does not merely describe the world we live in, it literally creates the reality of who we are becoming.
So the crucial question you have to ask yourself right now is this: what specific language are you using to narrate your own life's conflicts today? When you speak about your past traumas, your current frustrations, and your core identity, are your words constitutively trapping you into the pain of the past? Or are they actively, deliberately building the architecture of the self you want to be tomorrow?
The blueprint you draw with your daily vocabulary is the house your mind will inevitably live in.
So as you look around at the internal walls of your own identity, ask yourself, is it time to rewrite the code?